So let's talk about a few more economic things that were problematic to cities. One is called redlining. Maybe you've heard of it. All right. So redlining was a practice that had to do with financial institutions and insurance. So if there was a neighborhood that was considered so-called high risk, and these were neighborhoods that were primarily Black and Latino neighborhoods, the insurance company would literally draw a red line around that area, say this is a high risk area. If you want to insure a house there, if you want to insure a business there, we might just say no, or we're going to charge you more for it. Financial institutions, if you were going to borrow money to try to start a business, to buy a house, to improve your house, if you were going to try to get a home equity loan so that you could finance a college education, right? Again, to try to move towards accumulation of wealth, those financial institutions were much more likely to say no. All right, and this policy of redlining was a matter of course in northern cities throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s. It only really comes to people's attention to do something about it in the 1970s. Real estate. So people in the real estate business practiced several problematic practices. One is called steering, and steering is very simple. This is racial segregation by who you show houses to. So if you are a real estate agent and a Black couple comes to you and says, we're looking for a house, you show them houses in Black neighborhoods. You don't show them houses in white neighborhoods. Same deal if a white couple comes to you, you show them houses in white neighborhoods, not in Black neighborhoods. This is known as steering. It's no longer legal, but that practice lasts a really, really long time, and it contributes to segregation. Okay. Restrictive covenants had to do with the real estate business in general, and deed restrictions and stuff like that. So people might put a restriction to the deed of their house that you're not able to sell it to a Black person. You can only sell it to white people and stuff like that. And restrictive covenants were part of real estate law as far as racial discrimination for this whole period as well. Possibly the most insidious of practices is a thing called blockbusting. So blockbusting is a horrific practice that was used by real estate agents, and it contains just some of the worst stuff. If you want to think about sort of where racial prejudice comes from, and so on and so forth, these are people who would intentionally use racial prejudice to make a lot of money. Here's how blockbusting works. A real estate agent sells a home in an all-white neighborhood to a Black family. Now, they're charging a really high rate. They're like, this is a white neighborhood. The schools are good. They pick up the trash on time. It's a really great place for you. Congratulations, you've made it. All right. And so they sell a house to a Black family. And then they go around to every house in the neighborhood and they say, hey, a Black family just bought a house in this neighborhood. What that means is that everyone's house value is going to go down. All right? And this investment, right? You're a home buyer. You've made some investment. You're going to generate some wealth. All right? You've finally made it, right? Somebody's telling you that your investment is now going to fall through the floor. Why? Because a Black family moved into the neighborhood. So what they would do is they would scare all the white people in the neighborhood into thinking that they were going to lose their investment. Hurry up and sell your house before the housing prices go down. I have some houses I can show you. All right. And so then all these white families would pay top dollar to leave their neighborhood and move to a different neighborhood. All right. And then all those homes would be sold to African American families. All right. And so this is what's called blockbusting. And so what happens is the African American families are all paying premium for these houses, all right, which are worth a certain amount of money, all right? But once the neighborhood does become all black, the property value does go down, all right, because of redlining, all right? The white families who have now been taught that having black neighbors is harmful to you, all right, also paid premium to move to a different neighborhood, all right, whereas they could have stayed in their neighborhood, things would have been fine, but now they're sort of stretching themselves to buy these homes to get away from a neighborhood that they used to live in, so on and so forth. Who makes all the money? The real estate agents. And what is the lesson that we as Americans learn? That we shouldn't live near each other, that we shouldn't trust each other, so on and so forth. Okay, so blockbusting, also a practice that was commonly done during this sort of golden era of American prosperity. Okay, the last subject I want to talk about, I don't know, it's a series of subjects. I don't know if it's the last one. I want to talk briefly about the interstate highway system. Whereas things like blockbusting are deliberately, connivingly racist, whereas things like redlining are very openly racist, there are some things that are neglectfully racist, all right? Still racist, but that caused really serious problems in northern cities. And part of it has to do with the interstate highway system. So interstate highway system is pretty amazing, right? You can hop in your car and you can drive to California if you want. Not a good idea during the quarantine, all right? Stay in Massachusetts. But you can. The interstate highway system is really amazing. And for huge stretches of it, there's a lot of benefits to it. Okay, but in the design of the interstate highway system, there were also a lot of problems. As you can imagine, if you're going to try to link a highway from one place to the next, you've got to go across just thousands of people's property to get from one place to the other. And so the government has to acquire that. That's not a popular practice, right? So you've got to use eminent domain to seize people's property. People hate that, all right? And so as you're sort of planning where you're going to run your highway, well, you want to connect city to city and stuff like that. That's important because if that's a big population center, you want a highway to move between big population centers. That makes sense. The question is, where are you going to run that highway through a city? Because these cities, they developed organically, all right? Some cities much less organically. Like if you go to New York City, if you're in Manhattan, you'll see that, or Washington, D.C., you'll see that the streets are all on a grid. That's a planned city, okay? But still, they hadn't planned on a highway cutting through it, okay? Whereas if you go to a city like Boston, all right, you'll see that the roads don't seem to make any sense. And it's just because people built some houses and stuff like that, and they built a road up to the end of the houses, and then they built some more houses and they built some more road. It was really much more haphazard in a city like Boston. The point I'm trying to make is, if you're going to have a highway run through a city, you've got to knock down part of that city to put the highway in. Does that make sense? Some decisions that were made as far as how highways were built, it turns out, in hindsight, were pretty problematic. One thing you'll see a lot in northeastern cities, and if you look at a city like Springfield, Massachusetts, you'll notice that the highway cuts between the river or the riverfront area, or a body of water. It could be a lake or something like that. In Springfield, it's the Connecticut River, and the Central Business District downtown. So if you go on 91, you'll notice that the river's on your right and the city's on your left if you're heading south towards Connecticut. Stay in Massachusetts. Anyway, what people who study this thing have found out is that by creating this sort of dead space between the Central Business District and the riverfront leads to a lot of problems. And you also will see pretty commonly when mayors are trying to revitalize cities and so on and so forth, you'll see that there are lots of talks of riverfront development, the new development in the riverfront is part of a mayor's program to revitalize the city, and so on and so forth. But a lot of times these highways make it hard to do that. Okay, but worse than that has to do with the part of a city that these highways bulldoze through. So probably the best example of this would be the Cross Bronx Expressway. So if you've taken Route 95 through New York, Bronx is sort of the northern part of the city. You'll notice that you're more or less just driving through like a concrete tunnel for a while. The city is, up there. You're driving through this tunnel. You're hoping that your car's not going to break down because there's not much of a shoulder there. But you're just sort of shooting through the city. Now that's convenient as riding on 95 can be, that you can just do that. But the problem is what happened to that neighborhood and neighborhoods like that. So, like I said, cities develop organically. Okay, so if there's a certain number, there's housing in the city, there's businesses, and so on and so forth, and so these things just, it's like market economics, right? You open up a store in a neighborhood. If it succeeds, then it keeps going, and there's the right number of people sort of who can walk across the street and come to your store, walk down the block and come to your store, and that's how cities develop. All right. There's a certain number of businesses that a neighborhood can sustain. If there's too many, then it fails, so on and so forth. Okay, but when they built the Cross Bronx Expressway, and there's this is true about other cities, it's true about Springfield as well. They often go through neighborhoods that are poor. Okay, people who are wealthier, they're going to put up a stink about you running a highway right through their neighborhood. They're going to have to deal with all the construction, and it also is going to mess up the flow of their neighborhood. So when you put in a highway of cars going, 70 miles an hour, multiple lanes and stuff like that, the Cross Bronx Expressway especially was put through a neighborhood that was already poor, and it was sort of already struggling. But what it did was it sort of indiscriminately went through there as far as the lives of the people who lived there. Okay, and so whereas maybe I could walk to work, it's like 2 blocks, that way, and then take a left 1 block, and that's my job. At that time, now there is a tunnel of whizzing cars through that. I can't get across that anymore, and so the businesses that had popped up in these neighborhoods that had been supported by these neighborhoods and so on and so forth were suddenly cut off from people who used to just have to more or less cross the street to go to it. Now they couldn't, and so on and so forth. And so the interstate highway system is also causes a huge problem, and beyond proportion, the neighborhoods that were affected were poor African American neighborhoods, and so on and so forth, like the Bronx, which is pretty well known to be cash poor, but culturally rich. Okay, so that all happened, in the 1950s, the 1960s, and so a lot of neighborhoods economically failed as a result of that. Then a funny thing happened in the 90s and in the 2000s. People really started to rediscover cities, and they're like, cities are kind of cool. There's all sorts of cultural stuff going on. It's actually safer because there's so many people around. There's just more sort of eyes on the street. People realized that this idea of moving to suburbs and stuff like that was really isolating, right? Especially, oh my God, during that period when a woman was expected to stay at home all day while her husband went to work and the kids are at school, and here you are in this house in this neighborhood. You're isolated. All sorts of problems that come from suburban America. The fact that everybody leaves the house at the same time every day makes it more open for burglary and stuff like that. Whereas cities, it's people are coming and going at all different times. There's mixed use space, so again, you're not hopping in a car and driving 15 minutes to the store. You just sort of walk up the street and go to the store, so on and so forth. It's greener when people start caring about that. People have always cared about that, but when more people start caring about that, so you're not driving your car through a whole bunch of countryside so that you can appreciate that you live in the countryside. You just live in the city and you don't have a car. So when people become interested in cities again, now we have what's called gentrification. So gentrification is when an area that it happens in cities for the most part. Developers come in, they buy up a big section of the city, and they tear stuff down and they build up new housing and new spaces that are much higher rent than before. And so you have people who have lived in these cities, since sort of white flight started happening in the 1940s and 50s. People who have lived in generations, and they're living in a city, and it's tough, but at least it's affordable. And then all of a sudden, huge sections of the city are bought up, and all of a sudden, people can't afford to live there anymore. The rent becomes too high, or property taxes, or sort of anything like that. So gentrification becomes a serious problem that people have to deal with as well. And gentrification, again, sort of tends to be wealthy white people who want to come live in the city, displacing poor people of color who can't afford to live in their old neighborhood anymore. Okay? And often the wealthy white people are moving to the city for the cool cultural stuff that was going on before, but they then sort of drive that out and bring in their own suburban culture with it. Okay, so it's been a lot. This is economics. So what does all this mean as far as economics and structural racism? Well, what it means is that we've been spending a lot of time talking about the South, and it was important to talk about the North. And I should probably talk a lot more about the North. We'll talk a little bit more about it again when we get to the 80s. But the deal is that it wasn't any better to be black in the North. And so when people left the South, again at the end of World War I, or during World War I, during World War II, to come north, they didn't find some sort of promised land where people were all of a sudden nice and accepting of them. All right, they found a different type of poverty. They found a different form of segregation. All right, and these aspects of society, whether it's being left out of the GI Bill, redlining, steering, blockbusting, restrictive covenants, just having your neighborhood destroyed by the interstate highway system, or even gentrification, all this different stuff. This brings the story a lot closer, not only geographically closer, but also chronologically. Okay? Because really part of what we're trying to understand here is when people are like, oh well, slavery was a long time ago, or Jim Crow was a long time ago. Why does this stuff still matter? Okay, well it matters in a huge way because of economics and the generation of wealth. Okay, because if one family is slowly generating wealth from one generation to the next, passing on a little bit to their kids, even if it's just like home ownership and so on and so forth, all right, over time you amass wealth. And what does that mean? That means that you're not as stressed. You're not on the edge, all right? Because, people earn money, but it costs a lot of money to live. So yeah, maybe you're earning a lot of money, but if for some reason, I don't know, there's a global pandemic and a Great Depression and people lose their jobs and stuff like that, you're that close to sort of going over the edge, all right? Having wealth, having, whatever, home ownership or some sort of stock portfolio, something. It's a little barrier between you and absolute destitution. All right, so if I have wealth that my family has inherited, all right, every day I'm a little less stressed. Every day I'm a little less stressed, all right? And so I'm less prone to, having a heart attack, high blood pressure, right? Having a stroke, and so on and so forth. In general, stress, hormones, mess with your immune system. So I'm actually going to live a healthier life if I have the opportunity to generate wealth, okay? And what I'm telling you is that during this huge time of prosperity in the United States, the time that we romanticize as the golden era of American prosperity, okay, African Americans were left out of that, okay? From the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s, so that sort of like whatever, 95 to 2005, give or take a year, all right? Housing prices doubled during that time period, all right? If you owned a house in 1995, all right, that 10 years later, that house was worth twice as much, all right? If you owned stocks, all right, during that time period, stock values tripled, all right? So however much money you had invested in stocks, all of a sudden you had 3 times as much money, all right? The likelihood that if you were black and you were living in the United States and your family had been for that period, that you would own a house, that you would own stocks and stuff like that, all right, significantly less than if you were white, all right? And so this, we're at this point, we're up to the mid-1960s. This is, this is easily within a generation or 2 generations of who you are if you're watching this, okay? Now it starts to hopefully become a little more real. All right, we will talk a little bit more about education when we talk about, about economics when we talk about how education is funded and so on and so forth. So we will come back to that a little bit. But anyway, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.